G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day, and so far you're having a fantastic week. We are halfway through the working week. Now legends, of course, as always, we have a lot to go over. Of course, we need to look at a ceasefire proposal that Ukraine has agreed with in a large 180-degree turn since we saw what happened in the Oval Office last week. And with this, then the US has restarted their both hard and soft aid, so as far as intelligence and military equipment to be used in Ukraine again. And that just lets us know how much leverage the US actually has over these systems, that it can start and stop Ukraine's defense basically on a whim. So of course we'll be talking about that ceasefire and what Russia has said about it. Of course we will look at the maps, geolocations, but where we need to talk about is Kursk. And the situation in Kursk is dire. Many pages saying that it has come to then the completion of the operation. Ukraine over the past 24 hours has lost 91.3 square kilometres, and this is the largest single daily change I have seen in a very, very long time. And as I've stated multiple times, the Kursk operation, the Kursk incursion, whatever you want to call it, will either be the best game of four-dimensional big brain chess, or it will be a huge military mistake. And what I will say is this could not come at a worse time, considering that this week the American administration is meeting with the Russian leadership. And of course, then this ceasefire on the table, but we see those large changes and how negotiating processes between the US and Russia that will look. So let's start there. Let's start at Kursk and talk about what's happened here. So, of course, this map you're looking at is Ukraine, of course, with the capital of Kyiv in the middle of your screen. The red area is occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Now, just over 6 months ago, Ukraine launched a surprise incursion into Kursk. Now, originally, we thought this would just be a raid. Go in, get those easy areas, get the POWs and the conscripts sitting there, and then pull back after a few weeks. But after not reaching its initial goals, this stayed, and resources got poured more and more into this. And this has always been a big difference between tactics on the front line and strategy at the front line. Tactics may say you need to push and move here and there to increase that size or reduce that size, but strategy, we have said from the very beginning, is Russia to try and stabilise this and ignore it and tie up those resources. You may have actually been handed an opportunity, and we said this from day one, and I've copped an endless amount of shit from it. I do not think overall that the Kursk incursion was a net positive. Did some things come out of it as far as long-range weapon strikes? Yes. Has that been a game changer? No. And of course, did Ukraine get access to the South Korean weapon systems? No, as well, even with the claims of the North Korean soldiers on this front. So this is a very important area to look at, and we're just looking at this today. We step back then to yesterday. So yesterday afternoon it was 288, and then we'll step down to today when it's 197. So a very, very large change in only a 24-hour period. And what this does do, though, is this then puts a large amount of Russian forces only 30 kilometres away from the city of Sumy as well. Now, I just want to touch on that tactics and strategy for a minute, because this is something that I think there's a lot of confusion about, of what is tactics, what is strategy, and those two words get interchanged all day, and they mean very different things. If you want the most simple way to think about it, game of chess. Your pieces, they all do tactical movements, either one forward, two forward, straight line, diagonal, whatever. That is tactical movements. Strategy is what you are doing to try and get your then opponent to move their pieces in a certain way off, then of course where you add pressure or maybe move forwards or reverse as well. So that's a good way to think about it. I've always said the strategy in here, although it would be very unpopular, would look bad, is just to stabilise it and make sure then the resources are caught up in here. And let's have a look at a couple of maps and explain what we are seeing. So firstly, we'll look at my very first slide on this, that Kursk lost its strategic value the moment Russia chose not to thin out other front lines, but instead stabilise and focus on their logistics. It was at that point, which was very early, that we knew personally that I don't think this is going to be the game changer many said that it was. This became Russia's best front line. That there's 1,000 kilometre squares at one point with no vital industrial base, no tactical or strategic relevance, at least militarily, it's all PR, manned by your best soldiers and best equipment. This became a massive bonus for Russia when they didn't take the bait and Ukraine couldn't pull out. Problem is, this also removes any territorial bargaining chips from the table. And we know how important this salient is for Zelensky and his team, especially Sursky. This is like their baby, that they say this is going to be one of the main things on the negotiating table. Well, it's looking like, as of maybe in the next few days, there will be zero then occupied by the Ukrainians back into Russia. So the territorial bargaining chips has then weakened even further. Hopefully, we will see the correct military decisions made up in here, not just what is the best for PR. What I mean by this is not wanting to hold that victory, that informational victory this gave Ukraine, at the cost of pouring in more weapons and more men into disadvantageous terrain. As I said, I've stated it would be the greatest military 4D chess game of the century, or their biggest mistake. And again, it's given a lot of area that we know troops are going to have to be fed into, or were fed into, that eased up. We saw then gains on the south and the east going twice as fast. So let's look then at the Syriac map. Now, we're not going to compare these too closely, but I will say there's more on the eastern side and the northern side that Syriac is showing has come under control, and I'll confirm this with some geolocations in a second. Situation on Kursk front. Russian army recaptured 60% of Sudzha, as well as the towns and suburbs adjacent to the town. From the north, Russian forces regained control over these areas. From the south, Russian troops regained control over these areas. Russians resumed its advance east of Sverdlovskovo, forcing the Ukrainian army to accelerate its retreat to Sudzha. So either pulling back into Sudzha or pulling out of here as well. And this is all happening very, very quickly at the moment. Now, let's have a look at some footage. So we'll have to look up in the north. So this photograph came out here of these Russian soldiers at a war memorial here that then has been painted, tagged with Ukrainian flags. Of course, this is a Soviet war memorial, but let's look at where exactly this is. So we sit on the north, and it's just above then where Kozachi Lochnia says. So let's measure this. So we know they're around here, say 1.3 kilometres, close enough to a mile in from where that blue terrain is showing on this. Now, let's move on to the eastern side. Of course, we have Sudzha, the main area being held in then Kursk. We have just below here, still in the grey zone, we have footage of Russian forces then walking around in these areas. So we can confirm that is very likely red zone if you're just walking around on a main fire line like this down a bloody road. So I'd say it is definitely red. And then let's have a look at our final one. So just down, really this is the break-in into Sudzha. It's just about here. Again, I'm going to be a few hundred meters off, but it's close enough for what we are using it for. We're not using this for precision strikes. What we see here is then, of course, a Russian flag flown on this building here. So you can see the complete destruction. You also get an idea of what the ground is looking like here. You know, wintertime, everything's dead on the ground. Just for when we're comparing bits of footage, that is very important. So again, moving right into here, and I believe this was approximately 3 k's from here, yeah, and about a mile from the south too. So the pressure is on, and a lot of claims that Sudzha, 60% has come under the control of the Russian forces as well. So definitely keep an eye on everything happening around then Kursk. Now, before we look actually at the rest of the maps, let's talk about this ceasefire and what is being said. And like I said, this then large advancements in Kursk could not have come at a worse time. But what we've seen is Zelensky do a whole 180 on negotiations. That's no negotiations, no peace, and now being fully aware and wanting that now. But of course, this puts the Russians in a bit of an awkward position. So we'll talk about all of this. So ceasefire, this was from Financial Times, titled Ukraine Willing to Accept 30-Day US Brokered Ceasefire. Washington says it will immediately restore intelligence sharing and military aid after Kyiv accepts the proposal. Ukraine said it's ready to accept for immediate 30-day ceasefire, prompting Washington to agree to resume military assistance to Kyiv. The proposed ceasefire which would need to be agreed by Russia, was announced in a joint statement that capped several hours of talks between the US and Ukrainian officials in Saudi Arabia. Washington said it would immediately restore deliveries of weapons and ammunition and end its suspension of intelligence sharing. A couple of things in this though. Russia has stated multiple times that it does not want a ceasefire, it wants an end to the war, and I believe that's the path they're going to go down to try and get backed out of the corner that they are currently somewhat in. But a pause, what does a pause ceasefire at the moment, who does that benefit? Absolutely, it aids Ukraine a lot more than Russia at this point in time. Of course, Ukraine does not have the initiative on the battlefield, and they are short on all systems from men to bullets. So it would definitely aid Ukraine more so than Russia. I think if the Russians push back on this in any way, what they're going to say is yes, but after elections. And of course, what this will do is draw that out. Otherwise, it'll look like Russia is not willing to negotiate. But of course, what you put on the table first is your then lowest offer, and you negotiate up or down from there. But I think Russia will look to actually extend this process by wanting then the Rada to change the law that Ukraine can negotiate, as well as then elections in Ukraine too. That will be their way of drawing this out. I still don't get this though, that how can Ukraine go to something like this at the moment that it's still illegal? And I believe Russia will just say, well, it's illegal for you to do this under your own law. We'll wait until that comes through, and with the initiative on the battlefield moving, may get into a more powerful position. Trump told reporters Ukraine has agreed to it, and hopefully Russia will agree on it. Maria Zakharova, Russia's foreign ministry spokesperson, has said Moscow did not exclude contacts with US representatives in the next few days. We know they are catching up over the next week. A ceasefire, which could be extended with the agreement of both parties, would go beyond the partial truce signed by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky before the crucial meeting with US officials in Jeddah. Again, Zelensky is going to have to change laws if this actually goes into place, because if it takes two to tango with America as the intermediary, Russia can point at own laws and say, look, you have a law that you can't talk with us, so eventually this could just be nullified. Today's ceasefire plan comes hours after Russian officials reported the biggest drone attack on Moscow by Ukraine since its full-scale invasion. The claimed numbers were 90 drones targeting the capital, with 343 downed across the country. Again, you know me, when it comes to drones, when it comes to strikes, strategic strikes, the numbers that are given out by either Ministry of Defence or either supporting allied countries are probably bullshit, so we don't take into account that really at all. We may look for trends, because it may be 20, 30, 40% over-reported every time, so we can somewhat add that, but again, it's hard to know. We do have some footage of this, of then drones, multiple drones striking in Moscow as well. The biggest strike by Ukraine of this war so far. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who led the US team, said before you can negotiate, you have to stop shooting at each other. On Telegram, Zelensky said the US had proposed a complete ceasefire for 30 days, not only regarding missiles, drones and bombs, not only in the Black Sea, but also along the entire front. He also wrote, Ukraine accepts this proposal. We consider it positive. We're ready to take such a step. Again, how are you going to convince Russia to do this at this point in time? The US must convince Russia to do this. That's the carrot and the stick. The stick is not working, and the carrot being presented isn't great for Russia. Again, you're asking them to stop the war they have the initiative in at the moment. This needs to be taken into account. I don't care if people say the way the war could end is if Russia just withdraw tomorrow. That's great. It's idealistic. I could be a billionaire if Elon Musk gives me $1 billion. But that's not how you can base your decisions in life, that is just going to then occur. US National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, who also took part in the Jeddah negotiations, said the two sides had discussed substantive details on how the war would permanently end. This includes what guarantees they're going to have for their long-term security and prosperity, but also looking at what's it going to take to finally end this. He said Trump would immediately lift the US pause on aid and security assistance. Waltz added that he planned to speak with his Russian counterpart in the coming days. And of course, we know exactly where Lavrov will be sitting on this, and he has commented on it. Now, this is the statement made by Zelensky on Twitter, that Ukraine has been seeking peace from the very first second of the war. We don't take into account all the peace negotiations that actually took place very early on in the war that got turned over by the Brits, or mainly the Brits, but other nations too, okay? Ukraine proposed 3 key points: silence in the skies, stopping missiles, bombs, long-range drone attacks; silence in the sea, real confidence-building measures in this whole situation. Again, though, I propose, why would Lavrov, why would Russia agree to this at this point in time? In all of those, they currently have the upper hand. So, yeah, it may back Russia into a corner, but I actually don't think they mind being backed in. There's still ways they can somewhat slip this. On the US proposed, taking an even bigger first step, 30-day interim ceasefire, stopping all of these. Ukraine is ready to accept this, but the US has to convince Russia to do the same. If Russia agrees to ceasefire, it will take effect immediately. In my opinion, wherever the guns stop firing, that is going to be the like DMZ. That is going to be where that line is drawn. And Kursk is an example of that as well. So how likely do I think this is going to go through? I think it's fairly unlikely, but it does raise some concerns. This is from Kaja Kallas, one of the favourites on this. She, of course, is the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. She said, I welcome the US-Ukraine talks in Jeddah, notably regarding a ceasefire and resumption of US intelligence and security assistance to Ukraine, but also in humanitarian fields. The ball, as always, is in Russia's court. EU will do its full part to achieve just and durable peace, after last week tweeting that the West needs a new leader of the free world due to Mr. Donald Trump and his Oval Office spat with President Zelensky. So again, EU getting behind this. There's been a lot of shifting very recently as how people see this. Ukraine expressed readiness to accept this proposal to enact an immediate interim 30-day ceasefire. They'll lift the pause on intelligence sharing. This shows us just how much leverage the US, the United States, ISR actually has, because what has changed overnight, the tune towards US support and even EU support as well. Like we said, people look at the hard assets and go, oh, EU has this many tanks, America has this. No, you need to look at those soft assets. Even just Starlink being switched off, absolutely chaos. But if there was ever a time for a false flag event, now would be it, or at least when the ceasefire, if the ceasefire gets off the ground. Because we know one of the main pillars of a successful false flag is to undermine your enemy and the confidence within them as well. So this, I think, would be at a critical level. I believe it's already critical that we will potentially see or have seen false flags, but if there is a ceasefire, absolutely keep an eye out, because if X country breaks that, you know exactly how the US is going to be looking at that. Of course, false flags come with a risk, because if it backfires very, very hard. At least in Russia's case, it would. I believe Ukraine in the Western media, they could just about do anything they wanted, and it would be a hurrah, hell yeah, laws, armed conflict don't matter, as we've seen with some of the targeted assassinations throughout Moscow as well. But let's look at then what Suryak says about this. It should come as no surprise that the US ceasefire announcement comes at the same time as the resumption of aid to Ukraine. The aim of forcing Russia to accept the ceasefire is to provide an excuse for Washington to continue the war. A ceasefire is not expected to be accepted by Moscow at a time when it is pushing Ukrainian forces out of its territory and when there's still no guarantee of further concessions. The war will continue unabated for the first half of the year. Tatarigami UA says, then this. If the outcome of negotiations shows Ukraine's readiness for a temporary ceasefire, and this aligns with the US vision, the world will see whether Russia has any interest in peace negotiations or even ceasefire. The ball is now in Russia's court and the world is watching. Touches on this too, that if it was to be then negotiated that there is a ceasefire, someone would violate it quickly. In this, he says the Russians would violate it quickly, and then they'd blame Ukraine. They tried peace, but it didn't work because of Zelensky. Again, this is where I think false flags could be absolutely involved in here. But as well, putting the ball in Russia's court. The question is, though, why would Russia, who has the battlefield initiative, give 30 days for Ukraine to have respite, to rearm, regroup, if they are advancing on the front line, even with the US military aid? Now, the US military aid has been restored, but it hasn't been increased. And even when that aid was in place, Ukraine was still moving rearwards over the past 15 to 16 months. Lavrov, Russia's Minister of Foreign Affairs, he has already rejected the idea, saying it is just time for Ukraine to arm itself without resolving the causes of the conflict. And this is exactly how I believe this will work, is there will be a delay and try and throw the ball back. What I believe Russia's stance will be, their back is not completely against the wall like everyone is saying. They will say, we're not interested in ceasefires. We are only interested in lasting peace. So this takes away the card of, well, no, the Russians didn't agree, turning into, no, we don't want a ceasefire, we want an actual end. And this is where this diplomatic manoeuvring will take place. Secondly, they'll drag out the process. Of course, the longer the war goes on, we'll see Russia get more of a battlefield advantage due to the manpower changes and initiatives currently. I think we'll see this. Well, we are willing to come to talks, but Zelensky and the government, they have to make negotiating with Russia legal. So, of course, I've misspelt in my slide, but of course it is illegal to negotiate at this point. So that is definitely going to take some time as well. Also, the Russians and Trump don't see Zelensky as legitimate. So they may say, well, before anything, that needs to change as well. So they'll come and be like, well, we are willing, but our terms are that there has to be that law changed. There has to be a vote inside of Ukraine. We know how that would all look, and that just definitely does help the Russian forces at the very minimum. But again, entering this with very, very low bid and work your way up from there. Question is, though, what if Russia doesn't stop? It'll undermine Trump. And is he really willing to double down support to Ukraine then? If Putin just says, no, we're not doing that, we want a lasting peace, we want actual peace, and we want to take these bits and pieces, otherwise we'll continue it militarily, what is Trump's move then? Is he willing to increase support? Is he willing to decrease support or increase pressure on Russia? Well, we don't know. But one of the things we do know is with the support, we still know which way the border was moving. Again, I will say it, and I say it every time, Ukraine's problems is manpower and command. Those are bigger problems than even just supply of military aid, which anything the US does won't impact that manpower shortage at all. So it's a big, big issue. Legends, I'm going to blame the tumour, but I completely skipped over the other mapping folder. So I'll just cut this in here. So let's start south and we'll move our way up into the north and see where things are moving. So we'll come down, of course, we've got Dnipro River, Otterkiev, Robotny area. And what we are then looking for is Lobkove. So if we zoom in one more on this, we will see then Piatki, Stepove, Lobkove in here. Now, of course, I can't pronounce this correctly, but we do know due to this geolocation right here, on this intersection that sits just between the Y and the K, that the Russian forces have then raised a Russian national flag. So we can confirm that area is at least grey. Most likely that area is red, but we do know definitely that the border did shift somewhat, at least in and around this direction. No changes shown on the deep state map, but if we come around Kamiansky area, which is only, let's have a look, some 5-6 kilometers to the west, we then see Suryak is saying that on just the eastern side, or the southeastern side, there was some Russian advancement just in and around here. Again, I don't think these maps are too dissimilar, except if we move around that Robotny front. Then we move our way just to the west and we see Velyka Novosilka. Now on this map, there's no red check or blue, but if we step back one day, we can see that around Berlatsky as well as Novosilka, we can see an increase in grey zone and a decrease in Russian-controlled territory by this. Now, we bring up the Suryak maps, and he's showing the exact same movements around Berlatsky as well as Novosilka too. So we can confirm those movements definitely took place today. Maybe this is because a lot of resources, man and machine, are being routed from Kursk down into these areas, or vice versa, that Russians have moved up into Kursk. Maybe it might be a mixture of both, or just how the front line is very liquid at different areas. Let's then move our way up into Belhorivka, and these two maps today showing very different. Remember, I showed you geolocations of Russian soldiers here about a fortnight ago, and then if we bring up our Suryak map today, what we'll line up is, well, this is where this chalk quarry is. You can see where some of these tree lines are. This tree line heading down, this is right in here. So we're in line basically with where my cursor is at the moment, that there's been further advancement and that the Russians have taken the high ground of this chalk quarry / spoil as well. So not too many changes on the maps, but I'll let you know as it comes. Anyway, legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.